Apache twin girls invited him home. He didn't know they planned to marry him to their widowed mom. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
Richard had been moving west for 3 days without stopping longer than it took to water his horse and check his gear, because stopping too long invited questions, and questions led to attachments, and attachments had a way of costing more than they gave back. His purpose was simple and narrow. He carried supplies between two trading posts that preferred not to deal with towns, not to be known, and not to owe favors. He was paid to move quietly, arrive on time, and leave without stories following him. That was the kind of work that suited him. The afternoon light was sharp and unforgiving, washing color out of the land near the cottonwood flats, and Richard kept his eyes forward, already calculating how far he could push before dusk made the trail less honest. His shoulders were tight, not from the ride, but from the constant low tension that came from years of learning that danger rarely announced itself loudly. He rode alone by choice. Men who stayed alone long enough learned to hear things others missed and to trust the weight of their own decisions without needing approval. He noticed the movement before his mind shaped it into meaning. Something shifted near the brush ahead, too deliberate to be wind, too controlled to be an animal. His hand moved closer to the reins, and his posture adjusted without conscious thought. The result of habits built through loss and narrow escapes he did not revisit unless forced. His heart rate lifted slightly, not into panic but into readiness. When the figure stepped into view, his first reaction was confusion, followed immediately by a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with fear. Two children stood in the open, small and still, positioned where the trail widened, as if they had chosen the spot deliberately. They were Apache girls, twins by their faces, about 8 years old, their frames thin but not fragile, their clothing worn down to function rather than dignity. Richard slowed his horse to a halt and stayed mounted, his eyes scanning past them first, checking the line of trees, the shallow draw, the open ground behind. He did not see riders. He did not hear voices. That absence bothered him more than an ambush would have. Children did not stand like this unless they had learned not to run. The girls did not step back when his horse shifted or when leather creaked under his weight. One of them watched his face. The other watched his hands. That detail lodged in his mind and stayed there. Someone had taught them what mattered. He spoke carefully, choosing a tone that would not frighten them or invite challenge. "Where are your people?" The girl on the left pointed toward the low hills, her arms steady, her fingers straight. The other remained silent, her attention fixed on the rifle strapped to his saddle, not with fascination, but with assessment. "Our home is there," the first girl said. Her English was clean and practiced. She did not add please. She did not explain why they were here. She stated a fact and waited. Richard felt a brief flare of irritation, not at the girls, but the situation forcing itself onto his path. He had not planned to be involved in anything that required judgment beyond whether to push on or make camp. Still, he dismounted slowly, making sure they could see each movement, aware that sudden actions carried weight when fear lived close to the surface. His boots hit the dirt, solid and final. He studied them again, noticing details that made his stomach settle into a heavier place. The uneven braids tied with mismatched cloth, the shallow scrapes on their knees, the way neither one looked to the other for permission before speaking. These were not children waiting to be rescued. These were children managing a problem. He weighed his options quickly. Riding away would be easy. Following them would not. But leaving two girls alone in this stretch of land meant carrying that knowledge forward. And Richard had learned that some things followed you whether you wanted them to or not. "Lead," he said. They turned immediately, as if the outcome had already been decided. They walked ahead with measured steps, not hurrying, not hesitating, and Richard followed at a careful distance, his eyes tracking the ground, the brush, the angles of approach. His mind ran through possibilities. A trap, a misunderstanding, a camp he did not belong near. But alongside those thoughts was another, quieter one, pressing in despite his effort to ignore it. Someone had taught these girls to trust action over words. The camp revealed itself slowly as they crested a shallow rise. It was small, restrained, and deliberately plain. Low shelters set close to the earth. A fire kept tight and controlled. Tools laid out with intention. Nothing decorative. Nothing wasted. This was a place designed to avoid attention and endure pressure. A woman rose from beside the fire when they approached. She was Apache, early 30s, her posture straight, her movements economical. Her face showed where that came from responsibility rather than age. She did not reach for a weapon. She did not smile. She acknowledged Richard with a single nod and returned to the pot in her hands, continuing to fix something that did not appear broken. The girl stepped to her sides, close enough to touch her arms, and Richard felt the shape of the situation settle into place. This was her mother, a widow by the look of her, though no one had said it yet. A woman holding a fragile perimeter together with routine and restraint. Richard stopped several steps away and removed his hat, not as a gesture of politeness, but because covering his eyes felt wrong in a space this quiet. He did not introduce himself. He did not explain why he was there. He waited. The woman did not speak. Neither did he. The air between them filled with unspoken calculation. She was judging whether he brought danger or time. He was judging whether staying would cost him more than leaving. Inside his chest, empathy pushed against caution. He did not like that feeling. It complicated clean decisions. But he could not ignore the fact that these girls had stepped into his path because they believed he might change something. As the fire cracked softly and the wind moved through the cottonwoods, Richard understood that his original mission no longer mattered in the same way. The road had broken its pattern, and whatever happened next would not be accidental. Richard did not step into the camp as the light shifted toward evening, because crossing that invisible line without being asked felt like claiming space he had not earned. So he stayed near his horse and loosened the cinch with slow, deliberate movements, keeping his body angled so he could see both the shelters and the open ground beyond. The air cooled quickly, carrying the dry scent of earth and old leaves, and the change in temperature tightened the muscles along his spine in a way he had learned to respect rather than fight. He told himself he would only rest long enough to water the horse and let the animal breathe, that anything more would turn into involvement. And involvement was the one thing his work had trained him to avoid, but the camp behind him did not feel like a place that survived on luck alone, and that made walking away harder than expected. The twins moved with purpose as the day faded, one collecting thin branches sorted by size, the other adjusting stones around the fire so the heat stayed contained. They did not speak much, but when they did, it was sharp and practical, words used only when silence would slow them down. Richard watched without making it obvious, noticing how neither child wasted motion, how both checked the tree line every few minutes as if danger was a schedule they had learned by heart. Nalin kept her focus on preparation. She rinsed roots, set a small pot near the fire, and adjusted the firewood until the flame lowered into something steady and manageable. Her shoulders remained set, her expression neutral, but Richard sensed the tension beneath it, the strain of hosting a stranger without knowing his weight or his limits. As the sky darkened, Richard checked the perimeter without announcing it. He walked a slow arc around the camp, scanning ground and brush, reading faint marks that told him people had passed near here before and would likely pass again. That knowledge pressed into him quietly, not as panic, but as obligation. If he left now, he would be leaving more than a place. When he returned, one of the twins approached him holding a shallow wooden bowl filled with water warm just enough to take the edge off the cold. She did not hold it out like a gift. She set it on a flat stone near his boots and looked up at him as if the matter were settled. "Drink," she said. Richard hesitated for a fraction of a second, aware that accepting meant something here, then crouched and took the bowl, drinking slowly so they could see he did not waste it. The girl watched his throat move, then nodded once and stepped back, satisfied. Her sister hovered nearby, studying his face as if memorizing it for later reference. "You stay outside?" the second one said, not asking. "For now," Richard replied, and he meant it honestly. As darkness settled fully, Nalin finally addressed him without turning around. "You're not from a nearby camp." "No," Richard said. "You're not a soldier." "No." She paused, considering the space between statements, then spoke again. "You can leave before morning." Richard heard the warning beneath the permission. He understood it as a line drawn clearly, not cruelly. "I could," he answered. She glanced over her shoulder, her eyes meeting his briefly in the firelight, then returned to her task without comment. The twins finished their meal quickly and lingered near Richard instead of retreating to the shelter. One sat cross-legged close enough that her knee brushed his boot. The other leaned against a wooden post, arms folded, watching the dark like she expected it to speak. Richard rolled out his bedroll near his horse, placing it where he could see the camp without blocking it, and set his rifle within reach, angled so it did not threaten but remained unmistakably present. He removed his coat and folded it carefully, the routine grounding him, reminding him of nights spent alone where responsibility ended with his own survival. This night was different. He felt it in the way the twins tracked his movements, in the way Nalin adjusted her position so she always stayed between the shelter and the open ground, and in the way the firelight made the camp feel both fragile and defiant. As the wind shifted, carrying a sharper chill, Richard made a decision he did not announce. He did not saddle his horse. He did not prepare to leave at first light. Instead, he settled into his bedroll and took the first watch without being asked, his eyes steady on the dark, his thoughts moving through risk, consequence, and the quiet pull of responsibility. He told himself he was staying because the land was dangerous, because the signs were wrong, because two children should not learn that help always passed them by. But beneath those reasons was another truth he did not voice. For the first time in a long while, leaving felt heavier than staying, and that weight held him where he was as the night deepened and the camp fell in an uneasy, guarded sleep. Richard woke before the light reached the ground, not because of noise, but because his body had learned to surface early when unfamiliar land surrounded him, and he lay still for several seconds listening to the thin sounds of the camp breathing around him, the low shift of fabric inside the shelter, the soft crack of cooling embers, the distant scrape of a bird moving through dry branches. His horse stood calm, head lowered, rein slack, a good sign that nothing had come close during the night. He sat up slowly and checked the sky, noting the thin gray line forming at the horizon, and with it came a quiet assessment that surprised him. He felt rested, not fully, but enough to notice the difference. Staying alert through the night had not drained him the way it usually did. The responsibility had sharpened him instead of hollowing him out. That realization unsettled him more than exhaustion would have. The twins emerged first, barefoot, silent, already awake to the work of the day. One carried a small bundle of kindling nearly as long as her arm. The other dragged a shallow pail across the dirt, the metal scraping softly. They noticed Richard immediately, not startled by his presence, but reassured by it, and he caught the quick exchange of looks between them, a private confirmation that he had not disappeared. He rose and stretched his shoulders once, then took the pail from the girl's hands without comment and filled it at the seep near the rocks, testing the water with his fingers before carrying it back. The girl followed closely, watching how he walked, how he balanced the weight, how he set it down without spilling. When he finished, she nodded and moved on, task completed. Nalin stepped out of the shelter shortly after, her movements steady but deliberate, eyes scanning the edge of the camp before settling briefly on Richard. She did not greet him. Instead, she shifted a pot closer to the fire and adjusted the stones beneath it, her attention fixed on keeping the flame controlled. "You watched," she said, not looking at him. "Yes." She accepted the answer without further comment. But Richard noticed the slight release in her posture, a fraction less tension across her shoulders, and he understood that last night had not been a courtesy to her, but a test. The morning work unfolded without instruction. One twin sorted dried roots by size. The other checked a snare line near the edge of the trees, returning with a short shake of her head. Richard followed her path and examined the line more closely, finding the knot loosened in a way that suggested hurried hands, not weather. He felt a brief spike of anger, sharp and contained, and then the familiar discipline that forced it back down into usefulness. He returned to the camp and spoke plainly. The line was disturbed, not an animal. Nalin paused with a strip of hide in her hands, her fingers tightening once before resuming their work. How recent? Since yesterday. She nodded, absorbing the information without dramatics, and shifted her stance so she faced the tree line more directly. The twins, hearing the tone change, drew closer together but did not stop what they were doing. Richard recognized that behavior too. Fear acknowledged, not indulged. Later, when the fire burned steady and food simmered quietly, one of the twins approached Richard with a narrow wooden board and a length of rawhide. She pointed to a damaged frame near the shelter where a support had cracked. "Fixed," she said. Richard examined the break, crouched, and tested the wood with his thumb. He retrieved his knife, cleaned the blade on his trouser leg, and began trimming the rawhide with careful, measured cuts. As he worked, he became aware of Nalin standing closer than before, not watching his hands, but his face, reading the way he handled tools, the patience in his movements, the lack of hurry. When the strap slipped, Nalin knelt and braced the frame with her palm, her grip firm, her arms steady. Their hands worked within inches of each other, sharing space without acknowledgement. Richard noticed the scars along her forearm, faint but deliberate, the kind earned through labor and resistance rather than accident. He did not comment. He tightened the final knot and tested the tension twice before sitting back. The structure held. One of the twins placed a small piece of dried meat on a flat stone beside him. Not an offering. Compensation. Richard took it, met her eyes briefly, and nodded. As the sun climbed higher, Richard walked the perimeter again, this time with intention rather than caution. He memorized the terrain, the blind angles, the places where sound carried poorly. He was already thinking ahead, not just to the next few hours, but to what it would take to make this place harder to approach without being seen. That thought settled into him before he realized what it meant. When he returned, Nalin was watching him openly now. "You plan," she said. "I notice," he corrected. A faint pause followed, then she spoke again. "Not many men notice without wanting something." Richard met her gaze evenly. "I want quiet." That answer stayed between them longer than the others. As midday passed, the twins resumed their tasks with a renewed ease, and Richard became aware that he was no longer a variable to be managed, but a factor being accounted for. He did not know yet whether that was a place he intended to keep, but the decision was no longer abstract. By the time the sun reached its highest point, Richard understood that this morning had changed the shape of his presence. He was no longer just a traveler who had paused. He was a man being measured for how long he could be relied upon, and for the first time in years, he did not immediately resist that measure. The heat settled in late that afternoon, not heavy but persistent, pressing down on the camp in a way that slowed every movement and made patience a necessary skill rather than a virtue. Richard felt it in the way sweat gathered along his spine as he adjusted a strap on his saddle, and in the way his thoughts stayed tight and controlled, unwilling to wander into anything that could not be acted on. He had planned to leave by now. The fact that he was still there sat in his mind like an unanswered question. Nalin worked steadily through the heat, her pace unchanged, her focus fixed on tasks that kept the camp functioning. She repaired a torn carrying sling, then reorganized a small stack of supplies, her hands moving with quiet authority. Richard noticed that nothing in the camp was placed for convenience alone. Every object had a reason for where it rested. Survival had shaped her habits until they were precise. The twins drifted between shade and sunlight, restless but not careless. One practiced tightening knots with a short length of cord. The other traced shapes in the dirt with a stick, glancing up frequently toward the surrounding land. They did not need to be told to stay alert. That awareness had been taught early and reinforced often. Richard walked beyond the edge of the camp, farther than before, following a line of ground that dipped toward a narrow cut in the land. He crouched and studied a cluster of prints half filled with dust, older than the disturbance he had found earlier, but still recent enough to matter. These were not wanderers passing through without thought. Someone had slowed here. Someone had looked. The realization tightened his jaw. When he returned, Nalin looked up immediately, reading his posture before he spoke. "There's more," Richard said. "Not from today." She did not ask questions. She set down what she was holding and stood facing him fully, the wind lifting loose strands of her hair across her cheek. "They come close," she said. "Yes." She absorbed the answer with a controlled breath, then spoke again, her voice lower now, not for secrecy, but because saying it out loud made it real. "They came before you arrived." Richard nodded once. The timeline mattered. He understood now why the girls had stepped onto the trail so deliberately. This had not been chance. It had been a calculation made by children who knew the limits of waiting. Nalin turned away and reached for a pot near the fire, adjusting it though it did not need adjusting, her hands occupying themselves while something heavier moved beneath the surface. Richard stayed still, giving her space without retreating. "My husband did not die here," she said. The words landed with weight because of how plainly they were delivered. Richard did not interrupt. He was taken with others. They said it was temporary. They said they would return him when the road was clear. She paused, her shoulders drawing tight for a moment. He did not return. Richard felt the familiar pressure in his chest, not grief of his own, but recognition. He had seen that pattern before. Promises framed as necessity. Absence justified by distance. He kept his voice steady. How long ago? 2 winters. The twins had gone quiet without being told. They stood near the shelter now, close enough to hear, their bodies angled toward their mother, their faces unreadable but alert. Richard noted the way they did not cling to her, did not interrupt, as if they had learned that some truths needed room. Nalin finally faced him again. "Since then, we move when we must. We stay when we can." Richard weighed his response carefully. Sympathy offered too easily could sound like pity. He chose honesty instead. "This place is watched." She nodded, unsurprised. "Yes." He continued. "Not constantly, but enough." Silence stretched between them, filled by the dry rasp of the wind through the grass. Richard felt the decision forming before he named it. Leaving now would not erase the knowledge he carried. Staying longer would change the shape of his involvement. Neither option felt clean. As the lights softened, one of the twins approached and sat near Richard's knee, close enough to feel his presence, but not touching. Her sister followed, mirroring the distance on the other side. They did not look at him. They looked outward, toward the land, sharing his line of sight as if it were natural. Richard lowered himself to sit on a flat stone, accepting their proximity without comment. He realized then that they had already adjusted their understanding of him. He was no longer an unknown quantity. He was being placed into their daily awareness, assigned a function even if it had not been spoken. Nalin watched the 3 of them for a long moment, her expression unreadable, then spoke quietly. "You do not have to stay." Richard met her gaze. "I know." The fire crackled softly as evening approached, and the camp shifted into its next rhythm. No decisions were declared. No promises were made. But something had been acknowledged that could not be taken back. Richard felt it settle into him with uncomfortable clarity. This was no longer a pause along the road. It was a moment where leaving would require more effort than remaining, and for the first time since he had chosen a life defined by distance, he did not immediately move away from that weight. The day began with a change in the air that Richard felt before he understood it. A faint tension that made the land seem closer, as if the distance between things had narrowed overnight. He noticed it when he checked his horse and found the animal restless, ears turning toward sounds too faint to name, and when he scanned the horizon and saw nothing that explained the unease. Experience told him not to dismiss that feeling. It was often the first warning. The twins were already active, moving with an efficiency that came from habit rather than instruction. One carried a small wooden bucket, its handle bent from use. The other dragged a coil of cord that had been repaired too many times to count. They approached Richard together and stopped directly in front of him, blocking his path without hesitation. One of them lifted the bucket toward him and tilted her head slightly, indicating the shallow seep near the rocks. The other pointed to the cord and then toward the tree line where the snare line ran. They did not explain. They did not ask. The request was implicit and structured. Richard felt a brief, sharp awareness of what was happening. They were assigning him tasks, not as a guest, not as a helper, as someone expected to carry part of the load. That realization brought a mix of resistance and something closer to respect. He could have refused. He did not. He filled the bucket first, testing the water before carrying it back, then took the cord and followed the snare line into the thin cover near the trees. He crouched and inspected the damaged section carefully, noting where the fibers had been cut clean rather than frayed. This had been done deliberately, likely to see how the camp would respond. The thought tightened his jaw. As he worked, he became aware of Na Lin watching from a distance, not interfering, not directing. She allowed the situation to unfold on its own terms, observing what he did when responsibility was placed in front of him without ceremony. Richard retied the line with a different knot than before, one that held tension without revealing itself easily, and adjusted the position so it was less visible from a distance. When he returned, the twins examined his work closely. One tugged on the cord and nodded once. The other crouched to inspect the ground around it, then stood and looked at him with clear approval. No smile, no praise, acceptance. Later, as the sun climbed higher, Richard noticed movement on the ridge to the north, 3 figures far enough away to blend into the land if someone did not know how to look. He did not alert the camp immediately. Instead, he watched, counted, and waited until he was certain they were not drifting aimlessly. When they paused and turned their horses slightly toward the camp, he felt the confirmation settle in his gut. He approached Na Lin quietly and spoke low. There are men watching from the ridge. She did not react outwardly, but her breathing changed, deeper, more controlled. How many? 3. Not close yet. The twins sensed the shift before any order was given. They moved nearer to the shelter, positioning themselves without being told, their movements quick but not frantic. Richard noted that they did not ask questions. They had learned when questions wasted time. He adjusted his rifle and moved to a position where he could be seen clearly from the ridge, standing in the open long enough to register as a deliberate presence rather than a shadow. He did not raise the weapon. He let it be visible. He let his posture speak. The figures on the ridge hesitated. Richard held his ground, counting slow breaths, aware of his pulse but not ruled by it. He thought briefly of leaving, of how simple it would be to ride away and let the land swallow whatever followed. But the idea felt hollow now, disconnected from the reality in front of him. After several long minutes, the riders turned away, their interest satisfied or redirected, and disappeared into the uneven fold of the land. Richard did not move until he was sure they were gone. When he returned to the camp, one of the twins stepped close and placed a small tool into his hand, a worn stone scraper smoothed by years of use. The gesture stopped him. He understood then that this was not gratitude. It was trust. Na Lin watched the exchange and spoke quietly. "They believe you will stay." Richard looked down at the tool, then back at her. "I'm still here," he said. She nodded once, accepting the truth as it was, not pressing it further. As the afternoon wore on, Richard realized that the children's simple logic had already shifted the shape of his role. By giving him work, by placing tools in his hands, they had made leaving more complicated than remaining. And as he sat near the fire later, adjusting the scraper and thinking through the camp's weak points, he understood that this was exactly what they intended. The shift came without warning, not with sound, but with the sudden awareness that the land no longer felt wide enough, and Richard sensed it while he was tightening a strap on his saddle, his fingers pausing mid-motion as his attention pulled outward toward the ridge line where the light had begun to flatten shapes and erase detail. He straightened slowly and scanned the horizon again, this time catching movement that had not been there moments before, 3 riders emerging from behind a low rise, closer than before and no longer pretending to pass by. They moved at an unhurried pace, their horses walking with the confidence of men who expected to be seen and wanted to measure the response. Richard felt a controlled spike of tension in his chest, the kind that sharpened his thoughts rather than scattering them, and he immediately adjusted his position so the camp sat behind him, not exposed, not centered, but protected by his presence without drawing attention to the fact. Nalin noticed the change in his posture and followed his line of sight. She did not speak. She stepped back toward the shelter and placed a hand on each twin's shoulder, guiding them into cover with a pressure that was firm but calm. The girls obeyed without hesitation, their faces serious, their movements efficient, and Richard registered that they had practiced this kind of response before. The riders approached until their faces became clear, dust-streaked, eyes searching, their clothing worn but not poor, their weapons carried openly without being raised. One of them shifted in his saddle and glanced past Richard toward the shelter, his interest lingering too long. That detail settled coldly into Richard's awareness. He moved forward several steps, stopping at a distance that forced the men to address him first. His rifle remained low, his grip relaxed but certain, his stance balanced. He did not speak immediately. He waited, letting the silence stretch until the riders understood that he controlled the pace of this exchange. "Didn't expect to find anyone living out here," the lead rider said finally, his tone casual in a way that felt practiced. Richard kept his voice even. "Keep riding." The man smiled slightly, as if amused by the lack of introduction. "We're just looking. There's nothing here for you," Richard replied. The rider's gaze drifted again toward the camp, toward the low shelter and the fire reduced to embers. "Looks like there is." Richard felt the weight of the moment settle fully. This was not posturing anymore. This was a test of limits. He raised the rifle a few inches, not aiming, not threatening, simply clarifying the boundary. "I don't open my ground to strangers," he said. The men stiffened, their horses shifting under them, the tension visible now, no longer hidden beneath casual movement. For a brief span of time, nothing changed. Dust hung in the air. The wind carried no sound. Richard counted each breath, aware of his pulse, aware of the narrow margin between warning and consequence. Then the lead rider exhaled sharply and shook his head. "Not worth the trouble," he muttered, more to his companions than to Richard. He turned his horse, signaling the others to follow, and they rode off without haste, unwilling to show retreat, but choosing it all the same. Richard remained where he was long after they disappeared, his muscles held in readiness, his mind replaying the encounter with precision, cataloging every glance and hesitation. He understood now that the attention would return, not immediately, but eventually. Men like that did not forget places where they had been denied. When he finally stepped back into the camp, the twins emerged cautiously, their eyes scanning him before the land, confirming his condition rather than the threat's absence. One of them approached and stood directly in front of him, her face tilted upward. "They left," she said, stating it as fact. "Yes," Richard answered. She studied him for a moment longer, then nodded once and returned to her sister's side. Nalin met Richard near the fire, her expression composed but tight around the eyes. "They will come again," she said. "I know," Richard replied. She searched his face, not for reassurance, but for resolve. Whatever she found there was enough. She turned back toward the shelter and began preparing the evening meal, her movements controlled, deliberate, as if anchoring herself through routine. As night began to settle, Richard positioned himself near the edge of the camp where he could see the widest stretch of ground. He did not announce that he would take watch. He simply did it. Inside, something in him shifted with quiet finality. This was no longer about coincidence or courtesy. By standing where he had stood, by drawing that line and holding it, he had crossed into a role that could not be undone. The camp adjusted around that fact without ceremony. And, as the light faded completely, Richard understood that whatever came next would no longer be something he could walk away from without consequence. The night after the riders left did not pass quietly, not because of noise, but because of the way the camp remained alert long after darkness settled. Every movement measured, every sound evaluated before being dismissed. Richard stayed on his feet longer than usual, shifting his position as the moon climbed, choosing angles that gave him sight without silhouette, aware that sleep would come only after the land proved it could be trusted again. Near midnight, he sensed presence behind him before he heard footsteps, and when he turned, one of the twins stood there, wrapped in a thin blanket, her hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes steady in the low light. She did not startle at his movement. "You didn't leave," she said. Richard kept his voice low. "No." She nodded, as if confirming something already decided, then sat on a flat stone nearby and watched the darkness with him, her legs pulled close, her posture mirroring his without imitation. After a long pause, her sister joined them, settling on the other side, the three of them facing outward like an unspoken formation. They did not speak again until the night thinned and the stars began to fade. When the first gray hint of morning reached the edge of the sky, the twins stood together and walked back toward the shelter, leaving Richard alone with the cooling air and a strange sense of being observed by more than eyes. By full daylight, the camp moved again, slower than usual, as if everyone was waiting for something to be named. Nalin worked near the fire, her motions precise, her expression distant, and Richard noticed that she did not ask him about the night, did not comment on the watch he had kept. She already knew. The twins hovered close to him throughout the morning, not interfering, not demanding attention, but staying within reach, their presence deliberate. When Richard knelt to check the fire pit stones, one of them handed him a flat piece of wood to brace his hand. When he rose, the other tugged gently at his sleeve and pointed toward the shelter, then back to her mother. He followed, stopping a few steps away, careful not to cross into the space without invitation. Nalin did not look up immediately. She finished tying off a bundle of herbs and set it aside before finally meeting his eyes. "They told you," she said. Richard did not pretend confusion. "Yes." A brief silence followed, dense but controlled. The twins stood behind their mother now, one on each side, their hands clasped together so tightly the knuckles showed white beneath the skin. "They believed marriage would stop the men," Nalin continued, her voice steady but stripped of anything unnecessary. "They believe it would make us less reachable." Richard felt the weight of the words settle into his chest, not as shock, but as clarity. The idea had been forming around him already, shaped by the girl's behavior, by the way they positioned him, by the work they placed into his hands. Still, hearing it spoken removed any remaining distance. He answered carefully, "Do they believe this because they want it, or because they are afraid?" Nalin's jaw tightened briefly. "Both." The twins did not look at him now. They stared at the ground, waiting. Richard recognized that posture too. They had made their case. Now, they were prepared to accept the outcome. He did not respond immediately. He studied the camp, the shelter that barely held back the wind, the tools repaired and reused until nothing remained untouched by effort, the land pressing in from every side. He thought of the riders, of the way their eyes had lingered, of the certainty that this place would not be forgotten. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and precise. "I won't agree to something done out of fear alone." Nalin nodded once. "I would not accept that." He met her gaze fully now. "Do you want this?" The question hung between them, stripped of ceremony, leaving no place to hide. Nalin did not answer right away. Her eyes moved briefly to her daughters, then back to Richard. The pause stretched, long enough to be honest. "I want them safe," she said at last. "And I'm tired of running." Richard felt the final resistance inside him loosen, not into certainty, but into acceptance of responsibility. He did not promise love. He did not speak of futures shaped like dreams. He said only what he could carry without breaking. "Then we talk again when the sun is high," he said, with clear heads. Nalin inclined her head, accepting the boundary. The twins exhaled in unison, the sound barely audible but real. As Richard stepped back, he understood that the question had already changed everything, regardless of the answer that would follow. What had begun as protection had moved into choice, and choice, once named, could not be undone. The sun rose clean and sharp, cutting through the cool morning air and laying everything bare, and Richard welcomed the clarity because it left no room for hesitation or half-formed thoughts. He washed his hands at the seep, scrubbing away dirt and old sweat. Not because he needed to be clean, but because the action helped steady his mind, grounding him in the present moment rather than the road behind him. He had spent much of the night awake, not pacing, not replaying fear, but sorting through the limits of what he could offer and what he could not. He knew his own nature well enough to understand that promises made lightly turned heavy over time. If he stayed, it would have to be deliberate, built on choice rather than pressure, or it would eventually fracture everything around it. Nalin approached once the twins were occupied, gathering thin branches beyond the shelter, close enough to hear, but far enough to give the adult space that did not feel staged. She stopped a few steps from him, her posture straight, her expression composed, though the tension around her eyes told him she had not slept much either. They stood facing each other in full daylight, without firelight or shadow to soften anything, and Richard appreciated that. "I will not take you away from your ground," he said first, "and I will not expect obedience in exchange for protection." Nalin listened without interruption, her hands relaxed at her sides, her attention fixed on his face. "I am not looking to be owned," she replied evenly. "I know," Richard said. "That isn't what I'm offering." A brief silence followed, filled only by the faint sound of the girls' voices in the distance and the wind brushing across dry grass. Richard continued, slower now, choosing each word with care. "If I stay, it will be as someone who stands with you, not over you. I won't make your life smaller to make myself feel secure." Nalin studied him, weighing the difference between words meant to persuade and words shaped by restraint. She nodded once, a minimal movement that carried more meaning than agreement spoken too quickly. "And I won't accept a man who stays out of pity," she said. Richard met her gaze without flinching. "Then we understand each other." When the twins returned, sensing the shift without being told, they slowed their steps and approached cautiously, their eyes moving between the two adults. One of them spoke, her voice quieter than usual. "You stay?" Richard crouched, so he was level with them, making sure they could see his face clearly. "Yes," he said, "I stay." The answer did not send them into celebration. Instead, both girls nodded with solemn approval, as if a complicated problem had finally reached its correct solution. One reached out and briefly touched his sleeve, then withdrew her hand as though aware that too much emotion might break something fragile. The rest of the day unfolded with practical purpose. Richard rode out alone and returned with what he could secure quickly and cleanly. 2 plain metal bands bought from a trader who asked no questions and received no explanation. There was no bargaining beyond what was necessary. Richard paid and left, unwilling to turn the act into anything more than it needed to be. Back at camp, he set the bands on a folded piece of cloth near the fire and stepped away, allowing the decision to remain mutual rather than claimed. Nalin approached them slowly, lifting one between her fingers, testing its weight, its simplicity. "This is enough," she said. As evening approached, the camp felt different, not lighter, but steadier, as if uncertainty had been replaced by a shape everyone could now work around. The twins moved with new focus, their tasks completed quickly, their glances toward Richard no longer checking whether he would vanish, but acknowledging that he had chosen not to. When night settled again, Richard positioned his bedroll closer to the shelter, not inside yet, but no longer distant. He set his rifle down in the same place he always did, visible, reliable, part of a routine the girls had already learned to trust. Nalin sat near the fire, watching the flames burn low, and Richard joined her without speaking. For a long time, neither of them felt the need to fill the space. The decision had already been made, not with grand declarations, but with clear limits and shared understanding. Richard felt the final weight of the road lift from him then, not replaced by excitement, but by responsibility he accepted without resentment. Tomorrow would bring formality. Tonight, it was enough to sit where he was, knowing that he had stopped moving not because he was trapped, but because he had chosen to stay. They chose the morning carefully, not for tradition, not for witnesses, but because daylight made intentions visible and left no space for doubt. The sky was clear, the air cool enough to stay sharp, and the cottonwoods stood still, their leaves barely moving, as if the land itself had settled into agreement. Richard rose early and brushed down his coat with slow, deliberate strokes, smoothing seams that had been repaired more than once, then set his hat aside and washed his hands again, not out of habit this time, but out of respect for what the day represented. He felt no rush. There was nothing left to outrun. Nalin prepared quietly, tying her hair back with a clean strip of cloth, adjusting her deerskin dress until it sat comfortably on her shoulders, not chosen to impress, only to stand honestly in. Her movements were steady, but inside she felt a calm she had not known since before loss had narrowed her life into constant calculation. This was not rescue. This was alignment. The twins stayed close, dressed in their cleanest garments, their braids tightened with care, their faces solemn but bright with certainty. They did not fidget. They did not whisper plans. What they had wanted had already taken shape. A trader Richard knew arrived shortly after sunrise, a man who understood when to speak plainly and when to keep his curiosity contained. He removed his hat and stood where Richard indicated, saying only what needed to be said, no embellishment, no ceremony stretched beyond its purpose. They stood together in a small clearing near the edge of the camp, the fire reduced to embers behind them, the land open on all sides. Richard faced Nalin without armor of distance, his posture relaxed, his attention fully present. When asked, he answered simply, "I accept." Nalin did not look away. "I accept." There was no hesitation in her voice, no tremor, only resolve shaped by choice. Richard slid the plain metal band onto her finger carefully, his touch measured, aware of the weight the gesture carried. She did the same for him, her hand warm, her grip steady, sealing something practical and lasting. The twins stepped forward together and pressed close, one on each side, not clinging, not claiming, simply standing where they belonged. Richard rested a hand on each of their shoulders, feeling their small strength beneath his palm, and in that moment he understood that family did not always announce itself with joy or noise. Sometimes it formed quietly and stayed. They returned to the camp and shared food prepared from what they had, bread broken by hand, roots cooked slowly, meat divided evenly. No one rushed. No one held back. The circle they formed felt complete without explanation. As the light softened, Richard carried his bedroll into the shelter and laid it near the edge, leaving space without being asked. He placed his rifle by the doorway in the same position it had rested each night before, a familiar marker that told the twins the perimeter was still held. Later, when the girls slept deeply, their hands no longer clenched in readiness, Nalin sat beside Richard near the dying fire. She reached out and rested her hand on his wrist, not seeking reassurance, only acknowledging presence. "You stayed," she said quietly. "Yes," Richard replied. "I'm here." There was no need to say more. Outside, the land remained wide and demanding, but the camp no longer felt exposed. The road that had carried Richard for years no longer pulled at him, and the uncertainty that had once defined Nalin's days loosened its grip. What remained was steady and real. A home shaped by decision, a family formed by choice, and a future that did not need to be imagined loudly to be true.